Tonight, we begin with something that Russia has not experienced in more than a century. Something that last occurred in 1917, when an empire that appeared powerful from the outside was already collapsing from within. This is not a revolution. There are no crowds in the streets, no tanks rolling through Moscow, no dramatic declarations. But what is happening now is far more dangerous for Vladimir Putin. It is the erosion of obedience. It is the withdrawal of consent. It is the moment when the men with guns stop believing in the man giving the orders. For more than 2 decades, Vladimir Putin has built his power on one unbreakable principle: absolute control over the state and unquestioned loyalty from the military. Every institution was reshaped to serve that goal. Every potential rival was eliminated. Every sign of dissent was crushed. But today, for the first time in his presidency, Russian military officers are no longer obeying orders automatically. They are not rebelling. They are not announcing mutinies. They are simply not doing what they are told. And that is exactly how modern military collapses begin. The turning point came when NATO issued a declaration unlike any before. The alliance made it clear that further Russian provocations would be treated as potential Article 5 violations. Poland openly stated that it would shoot down Russian aircraft without waiting for approval. And when Donald Trump himself confirmed that NATO would respond with lethal force, something shifted deep inside Russia's military command. This was not an emotional reaction. It was mathematical. Every Russian officer with a map and a calculator reached the same conclusion at the same time. Russia cannot fight NATO. Not now. Not with an army drained by war in Ukraine. Not with tens of thousands of desertions. Not with soldiers who refuse to advance because another drone strike is almost guaranteed. Not with equipment that barely functions and logistic systems that are breaking down. And yet, despite all of this, Putin continues to escalate. He continues to provoke. He continues to issue orders that every professional officer understands could trigger a war Russia would lose catastrophically. That is when something unprecedented began to happen. Russian officers started saying no. Not publicly, not loudly, but in the language militaries have always used to resist suicidal commands. Orders began to slow. Objectives became unclear. Equipment suddenly failed at critical moments. Reconnaissance missions failed to locate targets they were supposed to find. Plans advanced on paper but never materialized in reality. This is not incompetence. This is institutional resistance. In the past 6 weeks alone, 3 major military operations personally ordered by Vladimir Putin never happened. They were not officially cancelled. They were not postponed. They were simply allowed to die during final planning. One was a large-scale drone strike against Polish logistics hubs. Another involved electronic warfare operations intended to jam NATO communications across the Baltic states. The third was a coordinated naval exercise that would have placed Russian submarines near undersea cables connecting Europe to North America. All 3 operations reached final planning stages. Resources were allocated. Units were assigned. Commanders were named. And then, suddenly, insurmountable obstacles appeared. Railways were undergoing unexpected maintenance. Specialized personnel became unavailable due to illness. Weather conditions turned unfavorable and stayed that way for weeks. These were not coincidences. This was the Russian military drawing a line. A professional officer corps had quietly decided it would no longer execute orders that could trigger Article 5 and destroy the Russian state. And in doing so, it began separating loyalty to Russia from loyalty to Putin. And Putin knows it. Vladimir Putin knows his generals are slow-walking his directives. He knows his colonels are finding excuses. He knows the chain of command he relied on for 25 years is corroding from the inside. But what makes this moment truly dangerous is that he cannot fix it. He cannot purge the officer corps. Not now. Not during an active war. Every general arrested creates chaos in command structures. Every loyalist replacement creates paralysis on the battlefield. The Wagner mutiny showed him exactly what happens when military leadership is disrupted mid-conflict. Confusion, fragmentation, and armed groups that answer to no one. So Putin is trapped. He needs his military to execute increasingly risky operations against NATO. But his military has concluded those operations are suicidal. He cannot back down without appearing weak. And he cannot move forward without his army's cooperation. The split is not public yet. No generals are holding press conferences. No colonels are signing open letters. But the evidence is everywhere if you know where to look. Putin announces aggressive postures, and nothing happens. Orders are issued, and no action follows. Threats are made and then quietly ignored. The gap between what the Kremlin says Russia will do and what the Russian military actually does has become so wide that Western intelligence agencies are struggling to determine who truly holds operational control. NATO sees this clearly. They know about the cancelled operations. They know about the resistance among mid-level officers. And they are adjusting their entire strategy accordingly. If Russia's military will not follow Putin's most dangerous orders, NATO can afford to draw firmer red lines. If Russian generals are actively preventing actions that could trigger Article 5, NATO can be more explicit in its deterrence, knowing that the Russian military itself is acting as an internal brake on escalation. This creates a bizarre and historically rare dynamic. NATO and the Russian General Staff now share a common interest: avoiding an Article 5 war. Both understand that Putin's provocations are pushing Russia toward a confrontation it cannot survive. And both increasingly recognize that someone must stop him from stumbling into catastrophe. History offers a chilling parallel. In 1917, Russian generals did not immediately overthrow the Tsar. They simply stopped believing in his ability to lead Russia to victory. They began making decisions without consulting him. They treated his orders as optional. And when the revolution came, the military did not defend him. They stood aside and let history unfold. Putin understands this history better than most. He has spent his entire career studying how power collapses, how states fall, and how armies withdraw loyalty from leaders they no longer trust. And now, he is watching the same warning signs appear around him. The officers turning away from him are not liberals. They are not democratic reformers. They are hardline nationalists who believe deeply in a strong Russia. And that is precisely what makes them dangerous to Putin. Because they have concluded that Putin is weakening Russia. That the war in Ukraine is destroying the military rather than strengthening it. That provocations against NATO threaten the survival of the Russian state itself. When career officers who have dedicated their lives to protecting their country decide that their president is the greatest threat to that country's future, the conditions for regime change exist. Not immediately, not tomorrow, but inevitably. Tonight, somewhere in Moscow, a Russian general is sitting in his office staring at an order he knows will lead to disaster. Maybe it is another provocation against NATO. Maybe it is another suicidal assault in Ukraine. Maybe it is a directive so disconnected from reality that obeying it would amount to betrayal of Russia itself. And that officer is making a choice. Not between loyalty and rebellion, but between obedience and survival. Between following Putin and protecting the state. This is how empires end. Not with dramatic revolutions. Not with tanks in the streets. But with quiet refusals. With orders that are never executed. With the slow withdrawal of consent by the men with guns. Putin's army is not marching against him. Not yet. But it is no longer marching for him either. And in Russia, that may be even more dangerous. What makes this moment uniquely dangerous is that there is no clear path back. Once a military begins to internally filter orders, once officers start deciding which commands are acceptable and which are not, the relationship between civilian leadership and armed force is permanently altered. Trust, once broken at this level, cannot be restored through speeches or purges. Putin can threaten. He can intimidate. He can reshuffle commanders. But he cannot force belief. And belief is the foundation of military obedience. Behind closed doors, Russian officers are no longer asking how to win Putin's war. They are asking how to preserve what remains of Russia's fighting force. They are calculating losses not in terms of territory gained, but in terms of institutional survival. How many trained officers remain? How many units are combat capable? How long before the army becomes incapable of defending Russia itself? These are not political calculations. They are existential ones. The Russian General Staff now operates under an unspoken rule. Escalation must be controlled, even if the president refuses to control it. Missions are evaluated not on political value, but on escalation risk. Any action that could provoke a NATO response is quietly neutralized long before execution. This means Putin is issuing orders into a system that no longer fully responds to him. That reality changes everything, because power in Russia has never come from elections or public legitimacy. It has always flowed from control of the security apparatus. The moment that apparatus begins acting independently, the president becomes vulnerable in ways no propaganda campaign can fix. Western intelligence agencies understand this dynamic well. They are watching patterns, not speeches. They are tracking what Russia does not do just as closely as what it does. And what they see is hesitation where aggression was once automatic. Exercises announced and never conducted. Red lines threatened and never crossed. Capabilities advertised and never demonstrated. This restraint is not strategic wisdom from the Kremlin. It is imposed caution from within the military itself. And NATO is adapting. The alliance is now speaking more openly, more directly, more confidently. Not because it believes Putin is weak, but because it believes Putin is constrained. Constrained by officers who will not carry out orders they believe will end in disaster. This is an extraordinary reversal. For decades, Western planners feared that Russia's greatest danger lay in its willingness to escalate recklessly. Today, the greatest uncertainty lies in how long Putin can continue issuing reckless orders without a mechanism to enforce them. That uncertainty is destabilizing, because leaders who sense their control slipping often become more dangerous, not less. History shows that when authoritarian rulers feel power eroding, they gamble. They take risks. They search for dramatic actions that can restore fear and obedience. But here is the paradox Putin now faces. The more extreme the order, the more likely it is to be quietly ignored. The more dramatic the escalation, the greater the resistance inside his own ranks. This feedback loop is deadly for centralized power. At some point, a moment arrives when delay becomes defiance. When selective obedience becomes outright refusal. When officers stop pretending that orders are merely impractical and begin acknowledging that they are illegitimate. That moment has not arrived yet, but it is approaching, and when it does, it will not look like a coup. There will be no announcement, no declaration of rebellion, no dramatic seizure of government buildings. It will look like silence. Phones not answered, orders not transmitted, units not moving. A president speaking and an army listening but no longer responding. That is the final stage of authority collapse. Putin may still control the Kremlin. He may still control the media. He may still control the courts. But without unquestioned military obedience, all of that becomes theater. Because in the end, power is not about issuing orders. It is about whether those orders are carried out. And tonight, inside Russia's military, an increasing number of officers have reached the same conclusion. Following Putin is no longer synonymous with serving Russia. And once an army makes that distinction, the fate of the leader is no longer a matter of if, only when.